Alright, let's talk about the absolute masterclass in reality bending that just dropped from PC Gamer. Because apparently, Highguard didn't flop. Yes, you heard that right. A game that lost momentum faster than a free crypto coin after the hype tweet. A game where layoffs hit almost immediately. A game where player numbers went from, maybe this could work, to, who's still playing this? And the gaming press looks at all of that and goes, well, actually, it's complicated. No, it isn't complicated. But this is what modern gaming journalism has become. They don't report outcomes anymore. They reframe them. Highguard is suddenly not a flop because, statistically speaking, thousands of Steam games do worse. That's the argument. That's the hill they chose to die on. Imagine judging a blockbuster movie not by its budget or expectations, but by comparing it to a random indie film shot on a toaster. That's basically the logic here. And it perfectly sums up the weird protective bubble that exists between parts of the gaming press and the industry. Because calling something a flop would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, another live service hero shooter dropped into an already saturated market and nobody cared long enough to keep it alive. But instead of saying that, we get essays about context. Context has become the ultimate shield. Players leave? Context. Layoffs happen? Context. Interest collapses? Context. At this point, context sounds less like journalism and more like a spell cast to keep bad headlines away. And here's the part that makes it even funnier. Even the article itself quietly admits that the studio clearly needed a big success to sustain its team. A normal launch wasn't enough, which means expectations were huge. And when expectations are huge and reality crashes, guess what we call that? Exactly. But apparently we're not allowed to say the word anymore, because the modern gaming press treats failure like Voldemort, the thing that must not be named. Instead, they invent these weird academic definitions where a flop only exists if a game becomes the worst catastrophe in human history. So now we live in a world where a project can lose players, lose staff, lose relevance, and still be declared not a flop because it performed better than 1,000 invisible releases no one has ever heard of. That's not journalism. That's grading on a curve so hard the curve turns into a circle. And honestly, this is why trust in gaming media keeps dropping. Players look at Steam charts. Players see layoffs. Players see community reaction. Then they read an article telling them everything is fine, and they feel like they just stepped into an alternate reality where numbers don't matter anymore. Highguard isn't some tragic, misunderstood masterpiece. It's a game that launched into one of the most overcrowded genres in gaming history, with a concept that people described as fine. And fine is the kiss of death in a live service environment. Because live service games don't survive on fine. They survive on obsession, on hype, on players coming back every day. When that doesn't happen, the math catches up fast. But instead of asking hard questions about industry trends, monetization strategies, or design decisions, parts of the press seem more interested in protecting narratives. It's like they're allergic to the idea that audiences might simply reject something. And the irony is brutal. The more they try to soften reality, the more disconnected they look from actual players. Because gamers aren't stupid. We don't need someone to explain why gravity works differently this week. If a game bleeds players and a studio shrinks, people will draw their own conclusions no matter how many think pieces try to redefine success. And that's the real tragedy here. Not that Highguard struggled. Games fail all the time. That's normal. The tragedy is watching parts of the gaming press twist themselves into philosophical knots, trying to convince everyone that the emperor still has clothes. At some point, journalism has to decide whether it wants to describe reality or edit it.